The Silent Mind of Steel, The Paradox of a Living Soul Without a Body. Alphonse Elric presents one of the most philosophically unsettling character constructions in modern manga. He is, in essence, a contradiction made animate, a human consciousness housed within an inhuman vessel. Unlike traditional depictions of armored beings, Alphonse is not protected by his armor, he is imprisoned within it. His condition is not merely physical, it is existential. He does not eat, he does not breathe, he does not feel, and most critically, he does not sleep. This final absence, often overlooked, is arguably the most psychologically devastating. Sleep is not simply rest, it is a biological and cognitive boundary. It divides experience into segments, allowing our mind to process, forget, and recover. Without it, consciousness becomes continuous, a single, unbroken stream. Alphonse does not live in days, he lives in one endless moment. Permanent consciousness and the collapse of temporal boundaries, the function of sleep in human identity. To understand Alphonse's condition, we must first understand what sleep does for the human psyche. Sleep serves three primary functions: cognitive processing, memory consolidation, emotional regulation, trauma integration, temporal segmentation, creating a sense of before and after. Without sleep, these functions collapse. Alphonse's inability to sleep removes the natural rhythm of existence. There is no psychological reset, no distinction between yesterday and today. Memory is not filed away, it accumulates. This leads to a profound consequence. Alphonse exists in a state of uninterrupted awareness, where time is experienced not as sequence, but as accumulation, the psychological weight of endless awareness. For most humans, consciousness is intermittent. We experience breaks, moments of unconsciousness that protect us from cognitive overload. Alphonse has no such protection. Every thought persists, every memory remains active, every trauma is continuously present. This creates a condition similar to chronic hyperawareness, often associated with severe anxiety disorders or trauma-related conditions. But Alphonse does not collapse under this pressure. Instead, he adapts. Mental fatigue without physical exhaustion, the illusion of tirelessness. At first glance, Alphonse appears tireless. His armor does not weaken, and he never needs rest. To an outside observer, he might even seem superior to humans. But this is a dangerous illusion. His body does not tire, but his mind does. Mental fatigue accumulates in subtler ways: slower emotional processing, increased introspection, heightened sensitivity to moral conflict. Unlike physical fatigue, which forces rest, mental fatigue in Alphonse has no release valve. He cannot shut down. Endurance as a psychological strategy. Because he cannot escape consciousness, Alphonse develops an extraordinary capacity for endurance. This endurance is not passive, it is active. He does not simply survive his condition, he manages it through internal dialogue, reflection, emotional regulation. In modern psychological terms, this resembles a form of adaptive dissociation, not detachment from reality, but controlled distancing from overwhelming stimuli. Existential isolation, the fear of non-existence, the absence of biological proof. One of Alphonse's deepest fears is that he does not truly exist. This fear is not irrational, it is grounded in his physical condition. Humans confirm their existence through bodily processes: hunger, pain, fatigue, sleep. Alphonse experiences none of these. This creates a terrifying possibility. If he cannot feel life, how can he be sure he is alive? Memory as identity and its fragility. Alphonse's identity depends entirely on memory, but memory, unlike the body, is not stable. It can be altered, suppressed, fabricated. This leads to one of his most profound psychological crises, the fear that his memories, his entire sense of self, might not be real. If his memories are false, then his personality is constructed, his relationships are artificial, his existence is an illusion. This is not just insecurity, it is ontological instability, a collapse of the boundary between being and non-being, the weight of memory without forgetting, trauma in high definition. Sleep allows humans to soften their memories. Over time, traumatic experiences lose their sharpness. Alphonse does not have this luxury. His memories remain vivid, immediate, unprocessed. Every traumatic event exists in his mind as if it just happened. This creates a condition similar to permanent re-experiencing, a core feature of post-traumatic stress, the absence of emotional decay. Normally, emotions fade, anger cools, fear subsides, grief softens. For Alphonse, emotional decay is significantly slowed. He must consciously regulate his emotions because they do not naturally dissipate. This requires extreme self-control, constant awareness, deliberate emotional processing, meditation as a substitute for sleep, stillness as survival. Unable to sleep, Alphonse develops his own form of rest meditative stillness. This is not traditional meditation, it is survival. By reducing external stimuli and focusing inward, he creates a sense of calm, a reduction in cognitive overload. a temporary escape from constant awareness. This becomes his version of rest, accelerated emotional maturity. This constant introspection leads to something remarkable. Alphonse develops emotional maturity far beyond his age. He becomes patient, empathetic, morally grounded. While Edward reacts, Alphonse reflects. This difference is not just personality, it is a direct result of his condition, perceptual sensitivity and the role of the observer, the eternal witness. Because he never sleeps, Alphonse becomes the group's constant observer. He is always present, always aware, always listening. This makes him a stabilizing force, a moral anchor, a silent protector. Awareness as responsibility. His heightened perception creates a sense of responsibility. He cannot look away. He cannot miss events. This reinforces his role as the one who endures so others can rest. Identity as resistance. Clinging to humanity. Alphonse's greatest struggle is not physical, it is psychological. He must constantly reaffirm, I am human, I am Alphonse. He does this through kindness, memory, moral action. These are not just traits, they are acts of resistance. The armor as a symbol. The armor represents trauma, isolation, loss of self, but it also represents endurance, identity, willpower. Alphonse transforms his prison into a symbol of persistence, the never-ending day. Alphonse's existence can be summarized as a single concept, the never-ending day. There is no night for him, no dreams, no escape, only continuity, and yet he does not break, the strength of quiet endurance. Alphonse Elric is not defined by power, but by endurance. His strength lies in remaining kind without comfort, remaining human without a body, remaining himself without certainty. He lives in a state that would psychologically destroy most individuals, and yet he persists not through denial, but through acceptance. While the world sleeps, Alphonse Elric remains awake not just as a guardian of others, but as a quiet defender of his own humanity, the paradox of moral clarity without physical humanity. In many narratives, morality is grounded in embodiment. The ability to feel pain, hunger, and fear often serves as the foundation for ethical reasoning. Yet Alphonse Elric exists outside this framework. Stripped of his biological body and Full Metal Alchemist, he lacks the very sensations that typically anchor human empathy, and yet ironically he becomes the most morally centered character in the story. This presents a paradox. How does a being without a human body become the most human in his ethical reasoning? The answer lies not in what Alphonse has lost, but in what he has been forced to confront. The ethical consequence of the failed transmutation. Original sin as moral foundation. Alphonse's ethical framework is inseparable from the brother's attempt at human transmutation, the act that cost him his body. This moment functions as a kind of moral origin point, shaping his entire worldview. Unlike Edward, who often externalizes blame or channels guilt into action, Alphonse internalizes the event as a permanent ethical burden. He does not simply regret what they did, he redefines himself through it. The emergence of moral absolutism. As a result, Alphonse develops a strong aversion to taking human life, justifying harm for greater good arguments, moral compromise under pressure. His philosophy leans toward a form of moral absolutism where certain actions, especially killing, are inherently wrong, regardless of context. This is not naivete, it is a deliberate stance rooted in trauma, empathy without sensation, the reconstruction of empathy. Alphonse cannot feel physical pain, yet he demonstrates profound empathy toward others who can. This suggests that empathy in his case is not sensory, it is cognitive and imaginative. He understands suffering not because he feels it, but because he remembers it, and because he remembers he chooses to care. Memory as a moral substitute for the body. Where others rely on immediate sensation, Alphonse relies on memory-based empathy. He recalls what pain felt like, he recalls what fear meant, he recalls what it was to be human. This creates a unique ethical structure. His morality is not reactive, it is reflective. He does not respond to suffering instinctively. He contemplates it, understands it, and then acts. The refusal to kill ethics in action. The line he will not cross. Throughout the narrative, Alphonse consistently resists the act of killing, even in situations where it might be justified. This is not weakness, it is discipline. Killing for Alphonse represents a point of no return, a loss of moral identity, the psychological cost of violence. Even without a body, Alphonse understands that violence has consequences beyond the physical. It alters the self, it erodes empathy, it creates irreversible guilt. He recognizes that to kill is not just to end another life, but to change one's own nature. Alphonse as the moral counterbalance to Edward. Impulse versus reflection. Edward Elric operates through action, quick decisions, emotional responses, pragmatic compromises. Alphonse, by contrast, operates through reflection, deliberate reasoning, emotional regulation, ethical consistency. This dynamic creates a philosophical tension between them. The function of ethical restraint. Alphonse often serves as a limiting force on Edward's more impulsive tendencies. He asks questions like, "Is this right? What are the consequences? Who will suffer?" These questions slow the narrative down, but they also deepen it. The ethics of identity. What does it mean to be human? Humanity as moral capacity. Alphonse's condition forces a redefinition of humanity. If he lacks a biological body, physical sensation, natural human functions, then what remains? The answer is the ability to choose, the ability to care, the ability to act ethically, moral agency as the core of being. Alphonse embodies the idea that to be human is not to have a body, but to possess moral agency. His choices define him more than his form, and in many ways he becomes more human than those who still possess their bodies but lack ethical conviction. Compassion as resistance, kindness in a violent world. The world of Full Metal Alchemist is defined by war, political manipulation, and systemic violence. In this context, Alphonse's kindness is not passive, it is defiant, the courage to care. Caring in such a world is dangerous. It exposes vulnerability, it invites pain, and yet Alphonse continues to care. This transforms compassion into a form of courage, the burden of moral consistency, the cost of being good. Maintaining strict ethical standards is not easy. It requires constant vigilance, self-restraint, emotional endurance. Alphonse bears this burden willingly, but it is not without cost. Isolation through integrity. His moral clarity can sometimes isolate him. Others see him as idealistic. His standards can feel unattainable. His refusal to compromise creates tension, but he accepts this isolation as the price of staying true to himself. Philosophical parallels. Deontological ethics. Alphonse's moral framework aligns closely with deontological ethics, particularly the idea that certain actions are inherently right or wrong. He does not evaluate morality based on outcomes, he evaluates it based on principles. Existential responsibility. At the same time, his condition reflects elements of existential philosophy. He must define himself through choice. He cannot rely on external validation. His identity is self-constructed. This creates a hybrid ethical model, principled yet self-defined, the soul as an ethical constant. Alphonse Elric's moral philosophy can be summarized in a single idea. The body may define limits, but the soul defines choices. Even without a body, he maintains empathy without sensation, morality without instinct, humanity without biology. In doing so, he becomes the ethical core of the narrative, not because he is perfect, but because he chooses, again and again, to remain kind in a world that gives him every reason not to be. In a world where power often dictates morality, Alphonse Elric stands as a quiet contradiction, a being without flesh, proving that the true measure of humanity is not the body we inhabit, but the choices we refuse to abandon. Duality of the self. Two minds, one trauma. At the heart of Full Metal Alchemist lies not just a story of alchemy, but a study of psychological divergence. Alphonse and Edward Elric are bound by the same childhood, the same loss, the same catastrophic mistake, and yet they become fundamentally different individuals. This raises a critical question: how can two people experience the same trauma and emerge with entirely different psychological identities? The answer lies in how each brother processes suffering. The shared origin trauma as a fork in the mind, the failed transmutation as psychological genesis. The attempted resurrection of their mother is more than a narrative event. It is a psychological fracture point. From this single moment, Edward loses parts of his body, Alphonse loses his entire physical form, but the true divergence is not physical, it is internal. External versus internal trauma processing. Edward processes trauma externally through action, through control, through defiance. Alphonse processes trauma internally, through reflection, through acceptance, through emotional integration. This difference becomes the foundation of their contrasting personalities. Identity formation, asserted versus questioned self. Edward identity through assertion. Edward's sense of self is forceful and declarative. I am who I say I am. I will fix this. He constructs identity through achievement, recognition, control over his environment. His automail limbs become symbols of this mindset. He rebuilds himself physically, reinforcing his belief in self-determination. Alphonse identity through doubt. Alphonse's identity is fragile, constantly examined. Am I real? Are my memories mine? Unlike Edward, he cannot rely on physical continuity to confirm his existence. This leads to deep introspection, existential questioning, a reliance on others for validation. The psychological consequence. Where Edward is anchored, Alphonse is floating. Where Edward declares identity, Alphonse must continuously reconstruct it. Control versus acceptance. Edward's need for control. Edward's primary coping mechanism is control, mastery of alchemy, strategic thinking, constant forward movement. Control gives him a sense of agency, a way to combat helplessness, a shield against guilt. Alphonse's acceptance of reality. Alphonse, lacking the ability to physically act in the same way, develops a different strategy. Acceptance. This does not mean passivity, it means acknowledging limitations, adapting internally, finding peace within constraint. Two philosophies of survival. Edward fights reality, Alphonse integrates with it. Neither approach is inherently superior, but they produce very different psychological outcomes. Emotional expression: fire versus still water. Edward's emotional volatility. Edward is emotionally expressive, anger, frustration, determination. His emotions are outward-facing, often driving his actions. Alphonse's emotional stillness. Alphonse is emotionally contained, calm, gentle, observant. But this stillness is not absence, it is controlled depth. His emotions run deep, but they are carefully managed. The role of emotional balance. Together they form a complete emotional system. Edward provides momentum, Alphonse provides stability. The body as psychological anchor, Edward's physical pain as grounding. Edward's automail causes him constant discomfort. Paradoxically, this pain confirms his existence, grounds him in reality, reinforces his humanity. Pain becomes proof. Alphonse's absence of sensation. Alphonse lacks this grounding mechanism. He cannot feel pain, fatigue, physical presence. This creates a dangerous void. Without sensation, reality becomes abstract. Embodiment versus disembodiment. Edward is hyper-embodied, constantly aware of his physical limits. Alphonse is disembodied, detached from physical experience. This difference shapes their entire worldview. Fear: losing others versus losing self. Edward's fear of failure. Edward's greatest fear is external, failing to restore Alphonse, losing the people he cares about, being powerless. His fear drives him forward. Alphonse's fear of non-existence. Alphonse's fear is internal, not being real, being a construct, losing his identity. This fear drives him inward. Direction of anxiety. Edward's anxiety is projected outward. Alphonse's anxiety is turned inward. Moral dynamics. Pragmatism versus idealism. Edward's pragmatic morality. Edward is willing to make difficult choices, strategic compromises, calculated risks, acceptance of moral gray areas. Alphonse's idealistic morality. Alphonse resists compromise, strong ethical boundaries, refusal to kill, emphasis on compassion, ethical tension. Their differing moral approaches create tension, but also balance. Edward pushes boundaries. Alphonse defines limits, dependence and interdependence. Edward's role as protector. Himself as responsible for Alphonse. He caused the loss. He must fix it. He must protect him. This creates a burdened identity. Alphonse's role as stabilizer. Alphonse, despite his condition, supports Edward. Emotionally, morally, psychologically, he becomes the one who holds Edward together. Mutual dependence. Their relationship is not one-sided. It is reciprocal. Edward gives direction. Alphonse gives meaning. Symbolism of brotherhood. Two halves of a whole. Together, they represent a complete human experience. Action and reflection, body and soul, control and acceptance, psychological integration. If viewed as a single psyche, Edward is the ego: action, will, identity, assertion. Alphonse is the superego: morality, reflection, restraint. Their journey becomes one of integration, divergence as strength. Alphonse and Edward Elric are not opposites, they are complements. Their differences are not flaws, but necessities. Without Edward, there is no movement, no defiance, no progress. Without Alphonse, there is no restraint, no reflection, no moral direction. Trauma did not break them in the same way. It split them into two paths, one that fights the world and one that understands it, and only together do they form something whole. Edward Elric burns like fire, loud, relentless, and impossible to ignore. Alphonse Elric endures like silence, steady, infinite, and quietly unbreakable, and between them exists a truth, that strength is not found in one way of being, but in the balance between them. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this deep dive, don't forget to like and subscribe.